that the husband was getting obvious. I handed her a GPS tracker and told her to put it in his car before he left for work the next morning. I wrote down his work address, drove there a few hours before 5, and settled back for the wait. It's fall in Maine, and the wind whipping through the trees was soothing in a peculiar way. I recorded a bit of the audio. You can listen to it as you read if you'd like. My client had told me that her husband Barty had recently started working late every night at the office. When I saw him leave a little before 5, my suspicions were all but confirmed. He slipped into his car and drove off down the road. I gave him a few seconds head start before turning my engine over and driving after him. My GPS was only accurate within a few hundred feet, so I didn't want to let him get too far away. Barty drove for 15 minutes or so before pulling off into a suburb. I drove past the turn, figuring I'd be able to find his car and not wanting to reveal myself. I pulled a U-turn and pulled into the neighborhood. Thick trees grew between almost every house, cutting off my vision. I drove around the windy roads of the suburb, keeping an eye out for his car. The sun was setting, and I was afraid that soon it'd be too dark to find him. Still, I kept my headlights off. It took me another few minutes, but I finally rounded a corner and saw him standing in front of his open trunk. I pulled into a neighbor's driveway down the street, hoping that the owner wouldn't notice me. He punched into his trunk, I assumed to pack something down. He slammed it shut and rounded the car, sliding into the driver's seat. His lights flipped on, and he drove away. That's when I noticed that the door to the house was hanging open. I looked back and forth between the tail lights and the now open front door. I still had the GPS, and something about the house was giving me the creeps. After he vanished behind a grove of trees, I pulled into the spot where he'd parked and ran up the steps to the door. "Hello?" I shouted. There was a light on inside the house visible through the open door. The wind continued to whip around me and the trees surrounding the house. I heard no response. I shot a glance around and stepped inside the house. It was a mess. I noticed several holes in the drywall by the kitchen. I also noticed a few red droplets of blood on the ground and counter. My entire body went cold. Had this guy kidnapped someone? I turned around and ran back to my car, opening up my GPS tracker as I did. He was driving away from the city. I pulled out of the driveway and gave chase. The tracker took me to an old back road that wound into the forest. I hadn't seen another house in at least a half hour. When I got close, I flipped off my lights and pulled off the side of the road. I grabbed the revolver I kept in the glove box and began moving forward on foot. I'd thought about calling the police, of course, but what would I say? This house in a bad neighborhood was left with the door open? No, I hadn't actually seen anything. Still, I knew I had to keep moving forward. I crept along the road, passing a sign that said "No trespassing." I was thankful for the wildly blowing wind. With any luck, it had covered the sound of my car and any sounds I was making as I walked. A decrepit house with his car parked in front was sitting half hidden on a hill in the distance. Barty pulled a woman out of the trunk and slung her over his shoulder before moving into the house. She had waist-length blonde hair that shimmered in the low light. I once again thought about calling the cops, but I figured they wouldn't have probable cause, which they'd need to get past the "No trespassing" sign. On top of that, what if he was about to kill her? Cops wouldn't get here for half an hour at least. I grit my teeth, checked my revolver, and crept forward. I reached the car and shot a look inside the trunk. It was too dark to see if there was blood, but something bright on the floor caught my attention. I reached down and picked it up. It was an intact human fingernail. That's when my fear overcame my resolve and I backed slowly into the woods to call the cops. I was right, it did take a half hour. But I was wrong, they did come all the way down to the house. 2 patrol cars with their lights flashing drove down the driveway. I was still in the woods, watching the front of the house. I was trying to control my breathing, telling myself that I wasn't a coward for not going in myself sooner. The police banged on the door, and Barty opened it. They spoke for a few seconds before Barty turned around and gestured for someone to step forward. A woman with waist-length blonde hair appeared, smiling and waving her hand. She wrapped one hand around Barty's arm. It was the same woman. The police left soon afterward. I sat in the forest for a few long minutes, trying to make sense of what happened. I had started the long walk back to my car when I heard a sound, low on the wind and barely perceptible. It was screaming. Screaming coming from the house. I left anyway. I didn't know why anyone would be screaming, but I lied to myself and said there must be a good reason. I'm back at home now and I can't stop thinking about it. I'm going to continue following Barty around. I'll update you all tomorrow with what I find. I'm a businessman that regularly commutes by train between Warsaw and Moscow. I could fly, but I've found that taking an overnight train allows me to do far more work while traveling. If you factor in the cost of a night in a hotel, it costs about the same as a flight. I hopped aboard a train departing Warsaw in the early afternoon. I always book my sleeping car to be the last car on the train so that I can watch the country fly by as the train moves. I took a short video of the journey which you can see here. I started working on my laptop, occasionally looking up to stare out the window that spanned the back of the car. The sun began to set as the train wound up into the mountains. Soon the thick forests on either side of the train were covered in a few feet of snow that reflected the red light of the setting sun. I was starting to get hungry, so I closed my laptop and made my way to the dining car. It was empty except for a single mother and her 4 or 5-year-old daughter. They were sitting at a table in the middle of the car. I took a seat at a table and soon a young Russian waitress came by with a menu. I looked over the selection of drinks and the 3 entrees that were serving. I ordered a scotch and steak, then turned to stare out the window at the trees whizzing by outside. The sun had set, so it was easy to see the reflection of the dining car through the window. The young girl was staring at me through the window's reflection. I made a face, raising my eyebrows and sticking out my tongue. She gave me an extremely concerned expression and tugged at her mother. Her mom turned around and shook her head. "Sorry," she said. "Lena is always staring at strangers. I'm Amelia." "No problem," I said. "I'm Yakub. I've got a niece her age back in Warsaw." We continued to chat as the waitress brought back my meal. I'd just started to eat when the girl began shrieking. Her mom jerked, staring down at her girl. She'd shielded her eyes with her hands and was continuing to scream at the top of her lungs. "Lena," she said. "Lena, what is it? What happened?" It took her a few minutes to calm down, but she refused to pull her hands from her eyes. Out the window," she said between her sobs. We looked out the window at the trees whizzing by. I almost didn't see it. There was a handprint on the frost that had built up on the window. I stood up and wiped at the glass, expecting it to slide off. That's when I realized that all the frost was on the outside of the car. Amelia stood up, pulling her daughter away. "I think she should get some rest," she said. "Of course, I'm sure she'll be fine," I said, still shaken. I forced down the rest of my meal in silence, ordering another scotch before heading back towards my room at the back of the train. The train had entered quiet hours, so most of the lights in the hallway had been dimmed to their lowest setting to help people sleep. I was just a car away from my room when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the roof of the train right above me. Whoever was on the roof had a noticeably strange gait. The sounds moved back down the train towards my room. I reached the end of the car and paused with my hand on the door. Something about the sound, something about that child's scream, something about how dark the forest had looked out the window gave me pause. Then I turned the handle and walked into my room. A humanoid creature with no mouth was hanging outside my window, staring into my room. It was pale white and had long claws coming from each finger. Its eyes were staring directly at me with a hungry expression. I threw my hands over my face and my knees buckled. When I came back to myself, I realized that I was on the floor, screaming and still covering my eyes. Several concerned passengers were crowded around me. I couldn't bear to look back out the window. I didn't sleep that night. I've been having a hard time sleeping ever since. If you're ever on a midnight train to Moscow, don't look out the windows. When I left college, I immediately started working as a genealogist. Basically, people pay me money to do research into their family history. I research the names of their ancestors, their causes of death, and any mentions of them in newspapers. I've been doing it for almost 10 years, and I'm good at it. A few weeks back, a millionaire widow called me up asking for my services. Apparently her parents had emigrated from Switzerland when she was young, but she didn't know much about them other than their names and the town that they'd been born in. It's rarely necessary for me to actually travel to a country to do my work, but I knew right away that I'd have to on this case. None of my usual sources had any info on the town she'd named. It was a small village high in the Swiss Alps. Apparently, none of the records there had been digitized. None of my usual routes worked. Baptisms, births, death certificates, all turned up nothing. I told my client that I'd need to travel there personally, and she quickly agreed to arrange the travel for me. I landed in the country in the early afternoon, picked up my rental car, and immediately set off into the mountains. I'd never visited the Switzerland before, but it was spectacular. Hidden valleys surrounded by sweeping mountain ranges, all connected by winding roads littered with switchbacks. My drive took me high up into the mountains. I turned around a curve, and drove directly into a thick curtain of fog. Visibility immediately dropped to something like 20 feet. On the winding switchbacks, that meant that you couldn't see the start of the turn until you've already reached it. Sheer cliffs loomed on either side, so I was eager to get off the road. I was considering just pulling off the side of the road and sleeping in my car. I was looking for a good spot when the fog cleared a little bit as I climbed the switchbacks. I rounded a curve and, to my shock, spotted a hotel sitting just off the road set into the mountain. Bright red letters covered the side reading Hotel Belvedere. There was a small parking lot with about a dozen parking spaces across the street from the hotel. I parked my car and made my way into the hotel to see if I could wait out the fog overnight. The inside of the hotel looked old, all dyed wood and wrought iron. A man stood behind the desk in the lobby, probably in his late 60s. When I shut the door behind me, he shot a tired look in my direction. "Speak English?" I asked. "A little bit," he said. "You want room?" I nodded and he continued. "Room is 125 francs. Good?" I nodded again and pulled out the bills from my wallet. The man sighed and held up a hand. "You are only guest tonight. I am owner of the hotel here, and I don't want to stay here all night. If you stay, you're here alone. Okay?" I was surprised at that, but I figured it'd be fine. The old guy didn't want to spend all night at a desk waiting for guests who would never come. "Yeah, that'd be fine," I said. "One thing," the man said. "If you stay you must stay in room with door locked all night. Okay?" I figured he just didn't want me messing around with his hotel, so I agreed. He turned around and pulled out my key, a wrought iron key that looked straight from the 1800s. "Room 7, he said. "Top floor." I headed up to my room and walked inside. It looked out of another century, sporting a sink and glasses inside the room. It also had a balcony with an amazing view of the windy roads that I'd driven up. Some of the fog had cleared, so I was able to take this picture. After the sun set I was getting pretty antsy. My body still wasn't ready to fall asleep because of the jet lag, so the hours passed, and soon it was a little past midnight. I lay in bed just staring at the ceiling. There was no cell service, and of course no Wi-Fi. I had seen the owner drive his car down the road, so I knew I was alone in the hotel. So I did what anyone would do in my situation. I explored the hotel. The place was old, like I said. It also had all the strange personalizations that I'd grown accustomed to in Europe. I walked across the hall to the room across from mine, and tried the door. It opened easily. The inside had clearly not been cleaned for years. A layer of dust covered every surface and spiderwebs decorated the corners of the room. I was using my phone's light to inspect the different surfaces, and its reflection glittered in the webs. I walked up to the window and rubbed away a bit of dust, peering through it. This side of the hotel would face up the mountain instead of down the valley like my room did. A full moon had risen, so it was easy to see the 30 figures standing on the road above the hotel looking down at me. They were spaced evenly, and each was carrying a candle. I froze, trying to get a better look. Each of the figures stood motionless, all staring down at the hotel. I couldn't see their eyes, but it was clear from their body language that they were watching me. Most only held candles, but I realized with a sinking sensation that some held scythes or other metal implements in their hands. I fumbled with my phone to turn off the light, and the room fell back into darkness. The figures on the road turned, and began walking down the road towards the hotel. I scrambled back from the window and ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. I ran through possibilities in my head. Was this some Swiss tradition? That didn't fit. What about the scythes? I checked my phone again and saw the numbers 1:05 a.m. blinking back at me. Maybe they would just pass by the hotel and head towards the village. Maybe they'd. An enormous bang rang out through the hotel as the front door opened. My mouth was dry as I scanned the room for a potential weapon. A heavy glass cup beside the sink was all I could see. I hefted it in my hand and backed up from my door, preparing to throw. A dozen footsteps rang out down the corridor, stopping just outside my room. The doorknob turned, and several fists hit the door. Still, the lock held. I turned back to my balcony, and ran out onto it. I tried to remain silent as I scrambled up onto the railing and jumped onto the balcony of the next room over. My feet hit the metal just as the wood from my room's door cracked and splintered from an impact. I heard footsteps in my room. The sound of my bed being flipped over. The dull ripping as they tore apart my backpack. The entire time, I didn't hear a single word spoken by any of them. I waited for hours on the other room's balcony, hoping they wouldn't step out onto mine. I heard the last of them leave, then I waited more. I waited until the sky lit with the rising sun, and only then climbed back to my room. It had been ransacked. My clothes had been torn apart and my laptop broken in two. I made my way down the stairs to my car. Luckily I had grabbed my car keys before leaving the room, and drove away from there for hours and hours. When I finally reached a city, I did some research. The website I found said that Hotel Belvedere has been closed for years.